takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tracy Pierce, and I'm a director with the Canadian Club Toronto. With virtual school and working from home together with some online shopping and entertainment options, there's no question that during the pandemic, internet services have become even more vital. Today, we are delighted to be joined by CRTC Chair Ian Scott to discuss how the Commission is working to improve access for Canadians living in rural and remote communities, as well as their work to promote choice and more affordable options, together with their continued anti-fraud efforts. Before we hear from our speakers, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. If your internet is slow, try the click here to switch stream button. You may notice some degradation in the video feed, but the audio should remain strong. If you want to ask a question, click the question tab, enter your question in the window, and it will be sent to our moderator. And finally, if you do require technical support, you're going to want to click the request help button in the lower portion of your screen. Now on to introduce our speaker. Ian Scott is Chairperson and CEO of the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. Ian has over 25 years of policy and regulatory experience in both the public and the private sector. We're delighted to have him joined by Shruti Shekar. Shruti is a technology reporter with Android Central. So before we begin, I'd ask you to raise a glass. It's one of the traditions we've been able to preserve in the virtual world. So grab your beverage of choice and join me in a toast to Canada.
To Canada.
Canada.
Shruti, the Canadian Club podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you so much for joining this conversation. And thank you so much, Chairperson Ian Scott, for joining us. I'm really excited about this conversation. We have a lot of ground to cover. I want to break it up in 3 specific topics: broadband services, wireless services, and of course, how the CRTC is tackling fraud and helping Canadians avoid spam calls, which, funny enough, I actually got 4 spam calls yesterday. It was insane. But that being said, I also hope my internet doesn't malfunction, because that would also be very ironic, especially since we're talking about how important these services are. And I'm sure you're all very well aware of how important the internet has been, especially now that we're in the pandemic. It's affected so many Canadians, and we're seeing that digital divide even more. So Ian, I'm hoping that we can first start our conversation on broadband. But before we get into that, I want to ask, how are you doing? How is everything going with you?
I am well. Thank you very much for asking, and thank you for inviting me to join in this meeting and discussion today. I look forward to it. They are indeed topical subjects, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to join you today.
Absolutely. So I want to first start off with broadband, as I mentioned, and I think it's very important that Canadians sort of understand, first of all, from a broad perspective, what the CRTC is sort of accomplishing in helping Canadians with broadband services.
Well, thank you for the question. If I look at broadband, more generally, if we go back to around 2015, the CRTC held a large proceeding, which was referred to as a basic service objective proceeding. And the core element in that was to look at whether or not broadband should be, the required service, the objective, as opposed to universal availability of telephone service. So it's been over 5 years since the commission, one, changed that basic service objective to focus on broadband, began the first steps to create the CRTC's own broadband fund. And finally, we also established the initial target, the aspirational target of 50 megabits downstream and 10 megabits upstream, which has now been formally adopted by government as the high-speed broadband objective, policy objective. So we've been focused on this for quite some time, and hopefully we are contributing to making sure that all Canadians have reliable and readily available high-speed access services.
Yeah, and I think that kind of segues nicely to my next question, because we're seeing so many Canadians that are being affected with internet disruptions, with trying to get connected to the internet. And part and parcel comes from the COVID-19 pandemic. This global pandemic has really affected so many industries and services. And it means that home internet connections are even more important. You're learning from home. We're having this conversation. We're so reliant on internet services. Can you tell us a little bit about how the CRTC is dealing with the pandemic, and how it's helping Canadians with broadband services today?
Again, thanks for the question. You're right, and we'll come back, I'm sure, to the question about digital divide, because it's very important. And as you pointed out, the areas and the Canadian consumers who do not have access to reliable high-speed service have been put at a particular disadvantage during the pandemic. But I want to start with the beginning of your question, where you talked about the challenges. And in fairness, I have to, tip my proverbial hat to the industry. In the first instance, both large and small players, for having navigated in a technological sense, in a network management sense, an incredibly transformative period without a lot of disruption. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the industry experienced complete transformations of, for example, peak demand times, which used to be in the evening after supper, and overnight switched to 9 in the morning, just after lunch, 2 in the afternoon, was trying to accommodate video meetings for people working from home, often 2 and 3 feeds, school coming from home, to say nothing of teenagers playing video games, or maybe not just the teenagers, after school, and so on.
Wait, are you telling me that you also play video games?
I'm not a gamer, but I certainly appreciate the bandwidth that is required to play them, and all of that was done in a largely seamless way by the industry, and they deserve huge credit for it. If I can digress a little bit, they also took measures to alleviate some of the pressures on consumers. Things like not cutting off for late, accounts for late payment and penalties and the like. And I like to point out, I had a conversation with the former chair of the FCC, Ajit Pai, who proudly told me that he had put out a proposed pledge to the industry, asking them to take those kinds of measures. And he was describing to me how much of the industry signed up. And in our usual understated Canadian way, I responded by saying that was wonderful and congratulated him and pointed out that I didn't even have to put out a request for a pledge. The industry, again, large and small, stood up and did that on their own and introduced those kinds of measures. So kudos to the industry in terms of what they've done. In terms of the impacts, obviously, as I said, difficult. They had to deal with changing demand cycles, obviously much more interest in higher speed and higher capacity packages or uncapped services. So all of the industry was really kept busy responding to the needs of consumers.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot of really good examples of how some of the national players have been, helping, as well as some of the wholesale carriers. They've also been working really hard to help Canadians stay connected. But, despite competitive frictions, and I think that's very, critical, especially when it comes to wireless or broadband, whatever we're talking about in this country. And I'm curious to know, in circumstances like this, are there any upcoming decisions or developments that could help these players? I know for past little while, I can't even remember how long it's been, there have been discussions or the decision on wholesale rates came out, and appeals were sent, and there was a decision that came out from the government, and there was a lot. And I want to get to that conversation, but are there any upcoming decisions or anything that the CRTC is going to do that will help these players when they're facing some of these challenges that you rightfully mentioned?
Obviously, I don't talk about prospective announcements about decisions. I can say, and I know there's lots of interest and pent-up demand with respect to the HSA decision, which is under a consideration by the Commission. That decision will be released fairly soon. Beyond that, there's a number of proceedings underway. We have a proceeding that was looking at examining barriers to the deployment of both 5G and broadband. What are the things that are challenging? We have a specific proceeding on support structures. So there's a number of things, and they're all important in terms of ensuring that, as not just the CRTC, but obviously governments, provincial, territorial, and the federal government are investing in broadband, trying to respond to the demands of Canadians, that there aren't obstacles in the way. So there's a lot of proceedings underway fitting that bill. I can't talk about the outcomes of them, but we're certainly focused on, as best we can, eliminating obstacles to the rapid deployment of the latest technology, whether it be in the broadband space or in the wireless space.
Yeah, absolutely. And with respect to that HSA decision, I know you said it's coming soon. I hope you don't mean it's coming today.
No, it's not coming today. I'm always loath to guess on the exact release date. I think it's fair to let people know that we release decisions when they're ready to be released, and it often seems like a very long time to get them out. But these are large, complex files. And once our work is done as commissioners in terms of actually making a decision and determination, the decision has to be written, translated, coded for, to be put on the internet and so on. And it takes time. But it isn't today, but it's—
Thankfully. Otherwise, I would have to get off this call and prepare myself, because I don't want to be in that situation. But it's very it's fascinating to know that how those decisions come out and when they do come out. And and I wanted to get your perspective on, or at least the CRTC's perspective on, what happens after, because what essentially is going to come, for those who are unaware, is that the CRTC is going to set the final rates. If I'm not correct me if I'm wrong, that's what's going to happen. And that is going to determine a lot of things for many players in the space. So from the CRTC's perspective, what comes after the aggregated wholesale rates? Can you talk to me a little bit about the CRTC's thought process for wholesale fiber access and the growth of the self-supplied middle mile?
I can. I'm glad you raised it, because look, there is no doubt that the decision with respect to final rates, wholesale rates for HSA are extremely important and to everyone in the industry. And that is why it has been such a contentious and frankly long-running file. But it is only one part. This is the establishment of final rates for one service. We have another process that is ongoing and has effectively been somewhat slowed down while we determine the final rates for HSA. And that is what we call the disaggregated service. And that might be what you're referring to. And that is where the transport aggregated service, the one we're talking about in this current decision, is a service that includes both the transport component and the access component, the last mile, so to speak. But the Commission's policy framework that was set back 2015, 2016, actually, takes a longer view, and the disaggregated service would mandate access to the last mile, but encourage the construction of facilities and the competitive supply of facilities in the transport segment. And that we are working, and the industry is all actively participating in establishing the terms and conditions and rates for disaggregated. So that's a really important element that hasn't really been the focus of a lot of the coverage because the immediate issue in front of us is the final rates for HSA.
Right. I'm looking to the side every so often. It's because I have my messages app open and I'm getting messages from the audience. And so if you ever see me looking to the side, that's what's happening. But I did get a question that I think might be interesting to get your take on. The question is, what do you think of service-based competition as opposed to facilities-based competition?
Wow, that's a big question, and it is something I think about a lot. I think I need to be a little careful here because I can give you a personal opinion. Obviously, I don't speak for the Commission in as a single voice. All of the Commission's decisions, I need to remind everyone, are made by the Commission, which means myself and my 8 Commission colleagues. We are all peers. I am only one vote. And we're supported by an expert staff, and we rely on the record of proceedings. So Canadians and stakeholders, create the record upon which we rely. So whenever we're talking about a commission view, that can only be found in its decisions and notices. But I can share with you my thoughts about if you will, my personal preference or a stronger belief and reliance on facilities-based competition. Perhaps this comes from my former background at the Competition Bureau in part, and some of my experience in the private sector. But I'll give you a simple example. Service-based competition can overcome barriers to entry very quickly. It can result in very quick changes in pricing, but there's less certainty about whether or not that form of competition will always be sustainable. Because if we describe it as arbitrage, then as prices come down, the margin available for arbitrage declines or disappears. And in a completely competitive market, it would disappear, and so might the competitor. In that particular case. And that doesn't really give us confidence that there'll be sustainable competition in the future. Whereas if you think about a party investing in facilities, even if the firm were to disappear, so to speak, the facilities don't go away. And so it creates an opportunity for someone else to acquire those facilities, and perhaps they re-enter the market with a lower unit cost and have a stronger ability to compete. And then obviously there are other considerations, the ability to control your own costs. You have more control in a technical sense and in an economic sense over your costs. So in general, I would say facilities-based competition results in more robust and sustained competition. That's my personal view.
I also have one more question before I go into our next topic on wireless, because some of the questions are wireless based, and I'm going to kind of save them for when we talk about wireless. And I have a lot to ask you, during that section. But I have one very interesting question, and I think I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Goes, we've seen prices decrease to some extent in wireless, but around the same time that the pandemic hit, home internet promotions disappeared. Prices have only gone up on premium plans, and affordable broadband plans for 50 plus megabytes per second are difficult to find even from reseller ISPs. What needs to happen to make home internet plans more affordable?
Well, that's a big question. I'm not sure exactly where to begin.
Ian, I don't think you realize there's a lot of people watching and they have a lot of questions.
I understand. Well, first, let's just parse it a little bit. So currently, if my memory serves me correct, the average price across Canada for 5010 service is about $69 Canadian. So should that be less? Ideally, of course. We always want lower rates. And our view is that lower rates and reliable service will be best accomplished through robust competition. And we do have a mixed model from broadband where we have wholesale, resale. So we have a mix of facilities-based entrants, some hybrid players that are both, and some who are providing it exclusively on a resold basis. If we look at during the pandemic, not surprisingly, consumers have opted for larger packages, uncapped services, higher speeds, because what may have worked perfectly in a perfectly acceptable way when there was one or two people on the internet doing a mix of things at home is not the same as when there are 4 or 5 people doing bandwidth intensive activities. So it's not surprising to me that the average has gone up. But if we look back from around 2015 to now, broadband rates have been more or less flat. And prior to that, prior to the Commission introducing this new framework of increased competition for high-speed access, there were pretty regular increases every year, and they were quite significant. That's no longer the case. So is that a perfect outcome? No. Would we rather see them declining? Yes. And do we intend on continuing to support competitive measures that will result in them going down? Yes. But I'm always caught by trying to look at how the rates compare. And it's always so difficult to find comparisons that are apples to apples. And so when we look at various international comparisons, sometimes the rates look worse than they ought to because you don't necessarily consider the demography and geography of Canada. One way that I tend to look at it, and maybe this is misery loves company, is to look more at a direct comparison with the United States. Because our rates—
Is that the right comparison to make though? We're all very well aware that the US has a much higher population than Canada, and their sort of structure for internet and for wireless and broadband is a lot different than Canada. So is that a fair comparison to make?
Yes and no. In another sense, I look at them as the more obvious comparator. Unlike many countries, but like Canada, they tend to have 2 wires into every home. They have a developed cable distribution network. They have, former telephony providers. They have a robust wireless network. The population density in many parts of the US is similar to that of Canada. Of course, their population is much larger and the territory is smaller. But given those things, you might assume that the rates would be lower in the US, and generally they're not. And I just said that it's hard to make comparisons. So I'm about to be guilty of drawing some, which no doubt could be challenged as unreasonable. But in anticipation of that question, I did a quick look yesterday to try and do some sort of, if you will, there may be facile comparisons, but some quick comparisons. I looked at average price for internet, at least 50 meg. The number that kind of worked by comparison was over 60 meg. And I looked at Boston, Montreal, Toronto, Buffalo, and Vancouver, Seattle. This is not a scientific or defensible survey. I am making no pretense to that, but I just did a quick looking at a 50 to 60 meg service uncapped. And the rates in Vancouver, it was 74 Canadian, in Seattle, 83 Canadian. In Montreal, it was 63, in Boston, 78. In Toronto, 72, Buffalo, 84. So I am not suggesting that this is a methodologically sound comparison, but it just gives you a quick indicator that we're certainly not out of whack with the United States. Then the question becomes, okay, but that's not the right comparison, because many other countries have much cheaper broadband services. But again, it's hard to make comparisons. Do they have the same geography or demography to deal with? I once attended a conference about broadband, and I was speaking on broadband filling the digital divide. And two of the other speakers, one was from Singapore and one was from the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom representative from Ofcom talked about certain parts of the UK that were harder to reach with fiber and the challenges of reaching remote areas. I found that a little bit ironic. Their remote in the Lake District of the UK is a little perhaps less difficult to reach than our remote. But the third speaker was from Singapore, and he talked about that their objective was to have fiber, redundant fiber, into every building, at least two, and preferably on separate support structures or conduit to ensure, diversity. You just can't compare some of these things. A city state with a high population density is not the same as trying to meet the digital divide in Canada.
Yeah, I would challenge you on that comparison again, specifically maybe on wireless services, which is the next topic that we're going to talk about. You can get 100 gigabytes of data on a T-Mobile service in the US for $45 US, which is, I want to say, my math, I can't do it off the top of my head, but I want to say around $60-ish with tax. I can't even fathom paying $60 for 100 gigabytes of data. Mm-hmm. I'm only on 20 gigabytes of data, which is insane to me. So there's a lot to discuss on wireless. And before we get into some of the nuanced questions, I wanted to just get your perspective on what the CRTC's role is in reducing that cost of wireless services. Can you give the audience, because there are some professionals who are very well aware of what the CRTC does, but there's probably a lot of people who aren't very familiar with what your role is in reducing those costs. So can you first tell us that?
I can, but I'm going to start by answering your question as squarely as I can. If you're asking me if rates should be lower for wireless in Canada, the answer is yes. If you're asking me if rates are too high, the answer is yes. And now I can answer your more broad question about what are we trying to do about it. We just put out a major decision not very long ago after an extensive proceeding to look at both the state of competition and some of the challenging issues. And no doubt we're going to talk about MVNOs, which was
absolutely, of course we are.
One of the issues that was very much at the center of that proceeding. But the first part of that proceeding was to look at whether or not individual providers of wireless service had market power, or either individually or jointly. And that was an extensive economic analysis that was conducted. And we made a determination that yes, there's joint market power in essentially all markets in Canada on the part of the big three national providers. And moreover, in some areas, there was unilateral single carrier market power. So that then begs the question of what do you do about it? because if there's market power and it's not constrained, that presumably logically leads to higher prices. So the answer is competition. And then we're back to the question of what is the best form of competition? And what we found in that proceeding was very good evidence that where there were facilities-based entrants, and as they gained market share, prices were markedly lower. And the best example of that was in the province of Quebec, which had the lowest average mobile prices. And the reason was because the facilities-based competitors in Quebec had garnered a higher market share. And so our decision, our framework, emphasizes that because we believe that the way to achieve lower rates is through robust competition, and that competition, the most meaningful form of that competition, is going to come through those facilities-based competitors. So our framework said, if you have facilities and you get spectrum, it doesn't preclude further entry, then you will have access to an MVNO arrangement that will allow them to expand more quickly, gain more market share, and have the desirable effect.
Right,
so
absolutely.
That was the framework, and that is what we believe, based on the record of that proceeding, is the best way to achieve the robust competition we need to drive rates down.
I think there are many people who can argue that this decision is really not an MVNO favorable decision. A lot of independent, wholesale carriers who, act as MVNOs can't really participate in this because, one, they might not necessarily have the funds to be able to take part in spectrum auctions, or they just don't have the funds to actually expand their facilities, as sort of the incumbents have done so. And that being said, too, this decision was released after the spectrum auction, the opportunity to participate in the spectrum auction closed. I know that the CRTC is not in charge of determining, spectrum auctions and all of that, but, two questions out of this. One, do you think it would have made more sense to make this decision before that option to register for the spectrum auction was made, because there is a very critical spectrum auction coming up in June? And two, do you think that the decision will actually create competition when there are so many players who actually can't even take part in this entire decision?
So the answer to both questions is yes and yes. Now I'll expand.
Please.
You asked me if it would have been better for our decision to come out earlier. And the answer is yes, but it wasn't ready. I mean, I just described earlier that there is a process. For those of you who have seen the decision, it's very large.
Yeah, I think you said it was like 170 pages or something crazy.
It's a very large decision. It's a very important decision, and it was released as soon as we could get it out. There was no strategy about the timing of a decision. I can't say any more to that. In a perfect world, would the sequence have been better? Yes. Does that preclude, parties from entering in that auction? I'm not sure. Yes, there was a deadline. There were also requests made to the department responsible for spectrum to change the deadline or to modify the rules. And it's up to them to rule on that. My understanding is they do not plan to change the date of the auction, but obviously that was a potential outcome. I'm not shifting blame in any respect. I'm just saying that is how the cards fell. And I make no apologies for it or excuses. We put out the decision as quickly as we could. As to the second point, you're asking me if I think our decision is the right one, and the answer is yes.
No. I asked you if the decision is going to create competition, considering that many players actually will not.
That's the point of the measures that are contained in the decision. So I answer again, yes, I do believe it will. We believe that is why we chose that option and that framework, because we believe earnestly that that is the best way to ensure robust competition for the provision of wireless services in Canada. Otherwise, we would have decided something different.
Absolutely. I remember when the decision came out, we actually had, I did an interview with you. And during that interview, I had asked you, I think there's a specific deadline or sort of 5 years or 7 years, I can't remember right now, until when that decision will be reviewed to actually see if, there has been some sort of competition that's been created and if prices have reduced and if it's actually, helping Canadians. And I had asked you, what happens if 2 years down the line, it does not seems to work out. Like the market is not picking up on it. It's not really helping. Will you go back and change the decision? And I remember at the time you had said to me that, yes, of course, if things are not clear or if things are not working well in the market, the CRTC will go back and review that decision and figure out what will work. In a circumstance of that happening, how long will it take? We saw with this wireless review decision, it took so long. And I think many people are very aware that the CRTC takes a very long time because there's a process, there's proceedings, there's comments, there's appeals that take place. It's a very long and robust process. Will that same amount of time be taken should you have to go back and review this decision, assuming that it's not working out in the market?
There's actually kind of a number of questions rolled in there, Shruti, but let me take one step back just to clarify a premise in the question, which is, we won't review it for, it's 5 years. The
Thank you. Yes.
MVNO conditions were 7. And it says we don't expect to have another proceeding. And this current proceeding that resulted in the latest decision was roughly 5 years after its predecessor decision. And that is so that there's some sense of predictability about the regulatory framework, which we try and provide to the industry, whether incumbents or competitors. If you look at it annually, you would be in a constant proceeding. To the point about the length of time, I think that's a bit of an unfair characterization. You're right, in a major proceeding, it takes time because parties need to be given the time to make their arguments and make their submissions. Canadians, thousands of Canadians submitted in that process. It also included, as I mentioned earlier, a fulsome market analysis, which is not something that's always done. And we do have that record done. Many other proceedings take much less time. People tend to point out the length of time it takes on certain ones, which tend to be large framework, policy framework proceedings, or ones that are incredibly complicated and detailed, like costing proceedings, such as the HSA process we talked about earlier. But others, I mean, they follow a reasonable timetable, given that we are a quasi-judicial agency and need to develop a record upon which to render our decision. All that said, what happens if we don't like the results of the current framework? We'll review it. So that was a very long way of saying yes. Again, you're on a roll.
I am, but I think the question.
So we would look at it. So rates are going down, and they've been going down progressively. Fast enough? No. And we will continue. We monitor the rates in detail internally and publish those numbers. And if the competitive environment is not sufficient, competition is not intensifying, and we're not getting the desired outcomes, then yes, we'll look at the framework and re-examine as required.
But will it take the same amount of time though?
No, I don't believe so, because I don't believe we would have to do the full analysis of market power again. And the proceeding, we're always in charge of the scope of the proceeding, presumably, and I don't like to crystal ball or look into the future, but I could envisage in the situation you just described, us scoping out a proceeding that said, what is the problem? We made a framework. We anticipate certain results. It's not happening.
Right.
Why is it not happening? And what can we do about it?
Right.
I may have just bound up a future chairman with a scope of a proceeding that he or she will not appreciate. But
absolutely. I want to talk about one last thing before we get into the conversation around fraud. And I think many members of the audience are very curious to know, some of your thoughts on this. But we're very well aware that there's a major merger of national carrier Rogers and regional carrier Shaw Communications, who owns Freedom Mobile, as many people know. It's currently being reviewed, so I completely understand that you might not be able to speak about that decision, or rather speak about any outcome right now, because you can't. It's being reviewed. But I really would like to know, are you able to talk about the changes in the market if one of the potential regional players disappears? Because if Rogers and the Shaw and Rogers deal does get approved, there is that concern. So I wanted to get your perspective on that.
Your premise is correct when you said it's difficult for me to talk about a hypothetical outcome, an actual process, but a hypothetical outcome. I should say two things at the outset. First, I spent an hour in front of a parliamentary committee along with the Commissioner of Competition and senior representatives from ISED, not answering that very question. Because they wanted to know, well, what might we do? What might the Bureau do? What might the department do? Obviously, we can't talk about the future. I should make clear, however, that the CRTC jurisdiction does not go to the issue of approving transfers of ownership. We are responsible for ensuring that Canadian carriers are indeed Canadian owned and controlled pursuant to the rules, but we have no role in approving that particular part of the transaction. Our responsibilities will relate to the broadcast distribution assets, pay-per-view licenses, and some other minor regulatory elements. And that's what we will be looking at. It is the Competition Bureau that will look at the issue of whether or not a proposed transaction would result in a lessening of competition. And it is up to ISED, the department, to look at whether the transaction raises issues with respect to the transfer of spectrum licenses from one company to another. So just so everyone understands sort of who has which dance partner. That said, it's really hard, even if it was appropriate for me or the Commissioner of Competition to talk about future outcomes, we don't know what it will be. As you described, if the merger is approved, and if the merger is approved, under what conditions? It would some or all of the assets operated by Shaw's Freedom be spun out, or none, or customers, or, and what would it be in what markets? There are so many elements, and it is for the Bureau to do that analysis and to come to a conclusion, and for the parties to satisfy any concerns the Bureau might have. So it's really hard to say, what might be the outcome. Now I'll try and answer the question in a more forthright way. If the market changed dramatically and there were less competition, then we'll have to look at that and take it into account. But we can't take it into account in the current framework because we don't know what it's going to look like in the future. Absolutely.
I want to move on to fraud, but these audience questions are so great, and I have to get to one of them.
I'll try and talk less.
No, please. I think your answers are great. There was a major policy direction that was given to the CRTC in 2019 to ensure that affordability and competition is thought, and any decision is thought with Canadians in mind, ensuring that affordability is there and competition is there, et cetera. This is the second policy direction that was given. The last one was given 13 years ago, I believe. That's big. That's a really, really big thing. And I know one of the ways that the question is, how has the CRTC followed the new policy direction that was given on competition and affordability? And of course, you kind of outlined quite a bit about the wireless review, but maybe you could talk about some of the other ways that the CRTC has sort of, followed this new policy.
Absolutely. So you are correct. There are two policy directions, and they're both in force. The 2009 and the one from last year. And they overlap in certain areas. One, in some sense, they are even a little bit, there's some tension between certain of the elements of the two policy directions, as there is in the Telecom Act itself. If you look at the list of policy objectives contained in the Telecommunications Act, they are, there's a natural tension between a number of them. So we're always trying to find the best policy outcome that meets all or majority of the elements. The policy direction is taken extraordinarily seriously. And if you look, for those of you who don't read commission decisions, I commend to you to go to the latter part of all of the decisions where we set out in detail exactly how we contemplated the policy direction. So the policy direction requires that we take it into consideration. It doesn't dictate an outcome. We are an arm's length independent agency, and we make decisions based on the record and that we believe are in the public interest. And we must take into account those policy directions, and we do, and we spell out exactly how we believe the decision matches up against the policy direction in all of our significant policy decisions. So the decisions speak for themselves, and we certainly do respond to them.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the last topic. We have about 5, 10 minutes, 8 minutes left. So I want to definitely get to this topic. I'm very curious to know, I mentioned in my introduction how
And yesterday?
Yeah. How, I received robocalls, but what actually I think is kind of interesting is, I've been reporting on robocalls and sort of how we're tackling this issue of scam calls, scam caller, spam, all of that for quite some time now. And I remember reporting about it quite a bit end of 2018 and quite a bit in 2019, because there were several decisions that were made by the CRTC then, and we'll get to that in a second. But then over the course of 2020, I noticed that I wasn't getting as many scam calls as I was, and I wasn't reporting about this as much. I was reporting about scams, like internet or email scams, that sort of stuff, but I wasn't reporting a lot on robocalls. And I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that. Are we seeing a reduction in robocalls? Why? What's happening here? I'm
going to say yes and no. Give you two answers this time.
Theme of the whole call: yes and no. Yes.
I'm going to do a little commercial first, because I think a lot of people don't realize the role the commission plays in this area, and perhaps we don't spend enough time telling the world what we do. I often, for the CRTC, I say the general public understanding is that we regulate the broadcast sector and the telecom sector, but we're also responsible for the anti-spam legislation and telemarketing, where we have the do not call list and so on. So while broadcasting and telecom are all about delivering services to Canadians, these areas are about protecting Canadians from unwanted communications and having a regulatory framework there. So that said, to try and answer your question, I'm going to go back to just a couple of statistics that I have stuck in my brain from a major conference I attended and spoke at it in the US a little while ago with the former FCC chair. And the number stuck in my head. I think it was November 2019. And for that month, and the reporting is US, but they're very similar numbers in Canada, there were about 2,000 robocalls per second made every day.
That's insane.
And of that 2,000 calls per second, something around 43 or 44% were fraudulent. So you're talking about, almost 1,000 calls per second are being made. So this is a major issue, and we are trying to deal with it. So the fact that you got some yesterday isn't exactly shocking, but we are working on it. I don't want to use up too much time. The answer to your question about have they gone down? The answer is yes. During the pandemic, the numbers actually declined significantly. What I can't say, that's good news. The bad news is I think that may have more to do with public health restrictions than it has with people giving up on making fraudulent calls or spoofing. There were shutdowns all over the world. There were restrictions on movement, restrictions on commercial activities. So it may be that some of the call centers that generate a lot of those calls and activity weren't as active as they were. But the numbers did go down markedly in Canada and the United States. I'll just finish my sort of advertisement if I can. We're trying to deal with this in a whole bunch of ways. And importantly, we're trying to use technology to fight, the abuse of technology. But you're never going to get rid of bad actors and people trying to, con Canadians out of their either identification or funds or personal information. And COVID has provided an extra opportunity for them to do so. When the government announced programs, to give financial or economic support to Canadians, the scammers immediately sent out messages saying, click on this link to get your funding or to apply. There's just a myriad of different fraudulent schemes. So we work with a variety of agencies, but quickly, some of the things we've done, you don't have to be quick, because actually my next question was, I reported on Stir Shaken and some of the other solutions, but I would really love to hear what some of the solutions the CRTC is sort of mandating or putting in place to sort of help Canadians with this. I'm happy to do that. So the end of 2019, we implemented what we called universal call blocking for malformed numbers. There's a term everyone can understand. This is when calls are coming in from abroad and they have not normal number patterns. If you expect a certain, 212 and it comes out as 000, they can be filtered. And we had the industry filter out those. That helped. Stir Shaken, which you described, is an authentication mechanism. It's currently in development. It's being deployed. It's not finished. But what this will do is allow for a verification within the system. When you make a call to me, your provider will be able to verify that the number does indeed belong to Shruti and that she's calling Ian Scott. And then I will receive a notification with the call, and it's yet to be determined exactly what that looks like, but it might be a green check mark or a green light versus a yellow light or a red X.
Right.
That says, yes, this is authenticated, or no, we're not sure, or no, it's not.
Right.
That will cut down on calls. We are continuing to work with the industry on developing a call trace system, which would allow carriers to trace back to the point of origin, spam calls and the like. And lastly, and I think this is important, we approved a trial by one of the major carriers to use artificial intelligence to filter out calls. And we've now extended that and have a proceeding underway to look at a more permanent arrangement. All of those will help, but we cannot eliminate. It's like fighting crime.
Yeah.
You want to eliminate, you want to reduce crime, but you can't eliminate it.
Absolutely. I have two very quick questions, and I know we have to wrap up really quickly, but the last question on fraud specifically is, as you mentioned, there are some new technologies that are going to be utilized. You're working with some of the carriers to implement this new technology. What efforts are you taking to protect Canadians' privacy when deploying this type of information? I know privacy has to do with the privacy commissioner, and there's a whole department that deals with that. But with respect to, deploying new technology or figuring out how this will help Canadians, where does privacy come in that?
It's part of our responsibility. It's shared. You're right. The privacy commissioner has his or her role, depending on who's in the office. And we have ours with respect to the telecom service providers. So we always look very carefully at proposed approaches, for example, to see what is being done with personal information and on the part of the carriers.
Right, absolutely.
So it is absolutely top of mind, and something that we look at as we look at the deploying of any kind of new service that might impact privacy negatively.
Absolutely. And just my last question, and I just want to address sort of the elephant in the room, which maybe you haven't recognized, but I know I have, because I've received several questions about Bill C-10. And I know that, today's conversation really is about what the CRTC is doing with broadband services, with wireless, with fraud, and combating that. But I think I would be stupid if I didn't ask you if you could comment specifically on C-10, and what your thoughts are on with what's happening right now with that bill.
Well, thank you for the question. I'll try and be very brief, and I'll put it in sort of two tranches. The first is that we support and need changes to the Broadcasting Act. So not specifically about C-10, I'll come to that in a second, but we do need changes. We need to have clarity about what we have jurisdiction over. We need to be able to gather data, and we need to have enforcement tools. And we've asked for all those things, and now quickly to move to C-10, those things are contained in that in the proposed legislation. And for that, we are appreciative. As to the specifics and the current debate going on, I would leave that to parliamentarians. Ministers and departments propose legislation. Parliamentarians make laws. And once it's all done and dusted, we will enforce, enact, and further the objectives of any new act as passed by Parliament and any new policy direction as issued to us by the relevant ministry.
Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you very much, Canadian Club, for hosting this chat. That's all I have.
Thank you,
Well,
Shruti,
thank you
for the dialogue. I've enjoyed it very much. And I want to thank the Canadian Club for inviting me to participate today.
Well, Ian, thank you for being as forthright as you can be, both yes and no. There's no question. It's a time of tremendous change for the media and the telecommunications industries, with the CRTC right at the heart of it. In particular, appreciate your thoughts on access and choice and pricing, which all remain so critical for both consumers and players. And Shruti, thank you for your expert navigation of the conversation, and to our guests for the great questions and the numerous questions. In closing, I'd ask our guests to consider a couple of upcoming events. On May 27th, we'll be hosting the founder and managing partner of Mavericks Private Equity, John Ruffalo. He'll be discussing both his newest venture as well as the importance of resiliency, super timely in the pandemic, in every stage of business and life. And on Tuesday, June 1st, we're looking forward to welcoming the Honorable Doug Schweitzer, Alberta's Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation, speaking to how Alberta plans to address growing and diversifying their economy. So lastly, thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and livemeeting.ca, for making the virtual gathering possible. And again, thank you to each of you for joining us.
Thank you for letting me put on a tie. It's been a while.
We're very impressed with that, Ian. Stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day.